Welcome, everyone, to Partner Up with Amy Carroll. As a communication coach, trainer, speaker, and author, I'm delighted to be your host and excited to bring you insights and ideas to help you solve your communication conundrums. This is the 25th episode of my show, Partner Up with Amy Carroll. If you want to find out more about me or what the show is about, feel free to listen to previous episodes on my website, carrollcoaching.com, or the VoiceAmerica.com business channel. And be sure to download the app or feel free to listen on your favorite podcast app. If you missed last week's show, I had a delightful conversation with Heather Carnes-Lee, an adjunct professor of leadership at IMD Business School in Switzerland. Among other things, we discussed Heather's research, which focuses on the development of self-awareness, authenticity, and the role of metaphor in breakthrough thinking and creativity. Be sure to check out the episode from February 12th. Today, my guest is Dr. Rima Azzam. Welcome, Rima.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here today.
Yeah, and I think I said, I made a creative version of your last name. As I added like an S, Azzam.
Yeah. Said it perfectly. Thank you.
Good.
Not an easy name.
It's to me, it's like Italian where there's phonetically everything gets pronounced. So it's not as hard as some names I've come across.
Yeah. And it means welcome.
Oh, I didn't know that in Arabic.
Welcome, yes. Or somebody who likes to invite people and welcome them into their home. Or
so they'll just say Azzam when they...
Well, I mean, it's a meaning. It kind of changes when you use it in sentences, but it also, a second meaning is willpower, somebody who has a strong willpower. So it's kind of fun to have those little stories behind our names.
How would you welcome someone using it in a phrase in Arabic?
I mean, the traditional is marhaba, ahlan, is kind of how we do it informally, because the Arabic language, you have both the formal and the informal, the classical versus the sort of colloquial. So the only time we use formal is in broadcasting or formal sort of government businesses, but it's beginning to dwindle away. So it's mostly colloquial.
It makes me think of Swiss German and High German. I wonder if that's similar.
It's somehow. I mean, I think usually I tell people it's sort of akin to classical Shakespearean English versus the modern sort of language of the modern English language.
Okay, that's a comparison I can hold on to. Yeah. So, Rima, give me a moment. I want to give the listeners some background on you so they know a bit more about you before we jump into this juicy conversation. Okay. So, Rima is a trained psychologist, educator, and coach. She was born in the U.S. to a Palestinian father, a mother born in Iraq to a family from Turkey who was raised in Lebanon. So now, Rima, I understand why you call yourself a Middle Eastern cocktail.
Yep.
And because of all that, understandably, Rima grew up on 3 different continents, in Asia, in Europe, and America, or lived in different continents, growing up mostly in Lebanon through part of the Civil War. And Rima's education, mostly her high school and university, was in the UK. Then she moved to the US in the DC area around the age of 25 to pursue not 1, 2 master's degree and a doctorate in New York City.
Picking them up along the way.
Okay, all right, good. I'm glad they weren't all simultaneous. So the doctorate is in special education. One of the masters is in neuroscience and education, and the second master's is in educational psychology. And also she has a certificate, that's the right word, in coaching from Coach U, which is where I got my coaching certificate.
Oh, wow. Small world, huh?
Yeah. Back in I started in 97. And I think a couple of years later, I finally completed it.
That's impressive. And a couple of years, that's great. It took me a lot longer than that.
Oh, did it? Oh, thank you for saying that. No, I was working full time. So it took my time.
I love it.
So something about Rima, no surprise, traveling is in her DNA. Now, you say you started at the age of 1. Someone took you on an airplane somewhere? Or?
Well, my parents my dad wrapped up his training And they decided before going back to Lebanon that they would do a tour of America. So here I am, baby carried at their in their arms, and they traveled throughout the US. And I have pictures that show me everywhere across the US. So I guess I started.
Been there, just don't remember it.
They kept telling me, when do you want to go to the US? Don't you want to visit? I said, but I thought you took me all around.
I've done it.
It's used to be the joke, yeah.
And it includes the travel 53 different countries, working in 11 different countries, most of them in the Middle East. And no surprise, she speaks 3 languages fluently, Arabic, French, and English. Oh, and I love this one. Listen up, listeners. She learned Portuguese because she got a contract to work in Brazil.
Yeah, cuckoo brain, huh?
When I get a contract, I buy a new pair of shoes.
Oh, I love languages.
Wow, that is impressive. Because I will share with you, when I was studying French I started in high school, kind of forgot it, had to restart again in college. And my college boyfriend, who was a sweetheart, said to me, honey, you have so much trouble with English. Why are you studying French?
Oh, that is so funny.
I know, and it's very true. I'm often very creative with my English. And is it true that you're now studying and learning Italian on top of all that?
Yes, I am.
What's your motivation for learning Italian?
Well, my husband is of Italian origin. He recently got the passport, Italian passport. He was born in the US. He's an American citizen, acquired his Italian. And I thought, and for me to get the Italian passport as his spouse, I have to be fluent in Italian. And really, I actually was 16 years old when I just was fascinated by Italian, wanted to learn it, started on my own. And when I landed in England, the school I was at wanted me to learn another language. They did not accept Arabic as the 3rd language. So I picked up Italian. So I guess it was always a language that I was attracted to. And now I had motivation to learn it more formally.
Yeah, I was very attracted to Italian. That was the language I wanted to learn in school. I was also very attracted to Italian men. So I think there might have been some connection there. Whatever it takes. Though, unfortunately, my high school didn't offer Italian. So that's why I ended up with French.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. French is harder, though.
Thank you for saying that. So here's my question for you. So now that the listeners have a good sense of your background, I'd like to spend some time talking about it and how it's impacted who you are. And so my first question for you, what have you learned about yourself, about human nature, as a result of living in all these different cultures and learning these different languages?
I think for me, at the core of it was having a clear sense of self, being anchored and rooted in a culture that kind of gives you a sense of identity, and then being open and curious about learning about other cultures and having the luxury in a way to pick and choose what you like about different cultures and incorporate them into who you are. I think that is a gift that sort of the world offers us.
So the main cultures would be for UK, Lebanon, US. Is that accurate?
I would say the core one is the Middle East, the Lebanon one.
Okay.
Because that's where I grew up and was raised. And so that's the core. The others were additional ones that I acquired as I went along.
Okay, so let's start with Lebanon. What were some of the qualities from that culture that you particularly appreciated and wanted to carry with you?
So I would say the Lebanese have a joie de vivre that's beautiful, that engagement with life, knowing how to live and live well through social engagement, through cultural activities, through travel. There's that passion for life and good food and party. Yes. I love that. And there's a sense of community. There's a sense of truly belonging. And because it's a small community, everybody knows everyone. Mm-hmm. So on the plus side, you feel like you are seen, you matter, you are a known quantity and entity in the fullness of who you are versus an anonymous individual on this planet. And so that strong sense of community and support and family ties are so powerful, and they really, I feel they anchored me emotionally, mentally, physically. It feels like you've got a solid base, a solid platform to work from.
And that speaks to me when I think about I'm sure you know this already, one of the basic human needs is the sense of belonging. And that's what you describe from that kind of community.
Exactly.
Wow.
Yeah. So that aspect is so powerful, and it still is very much part of who I am. Wherever I go, it's so entrenched in who I am and how I engage with people.
So what's a specific example of how you bring that into your life on a daily basis?
Social life, friends, always surrounded with friends, having an open home, a gathering place. So whenever we have an outing or whatever, it starts with, hey, come over to the house, we'll hang up for a bit and then go out, or we go out and then come back home. So home is it's more than a house, it's a home. It's sort of where you gather, where you share memories, where you have fun, where you deal with every aspect of life, where you kind of support each other in kind of hard times, easy times, fun times. So there's that kind of surrounding oneself and being with the community of people you love. And in fact, when I moved to the US, the first thing so let me back up a second. When I was a kid, my parents used to tease me. Whenever they wanted to mess around with me, they'd say, Yankee, go home. And I'd say, if I'm to go home, I'm dragging you with me. I moved to the US in 85, 86. They were all here in Washington, D.C.
You brought them over. Fantastic.
Yeah. So it's having that sort of sense of bringing my mini community here. And that sort of it always gave me that space of being able to then feel free to explore. It's almost like a little child who knows mommy is nearby, I'm safe, and therefore I can turn my attention to the world out there.
Yeah.
Which is really beautiful. I mean, that's kind of a real gift. I think of it as a precious gift.
So that's a very powerful example from the Lebanese culture. Let's move to the UK. From the UK culture are qualities that you maintain and have brought with you?
So I was made aware by my father before we went to England and said, Rima, in Lebanon, we tend to be very bombastic. We speak loudly. We're full of passion. In England, people are very polite, very quiet. You need to bring the volume of your voice down and speak softly. That gave me the trigger of awareness of how I needed to observe and be a little bit more cognizant of how things are different from where I was raised. This was my first exposure living in a place. I mean, travel, you go in as a tourist, it's different.
Right.
Observation led me to sort of notice how polite people were, how modest they were, that kind of gentleness. And that really appealed to me. And I thought, I really love that about the British. And so I began to try and figure out a way of making that part of who I am. Took a while to bring that volume down. And whenever I get excited, volume goes up. And that is me. I don't think I'll ever be able to fully change that, but it sort of modulates depending. And I kind of learned to almost mirror my environment as a strategy to connect to the world I'm in through observation, mirror.
So I'm hearing a high level of adaptability that you developed.
Adaptability while always being cognizant of what is authentically me. So I would not, if something doesn't feel right for me, I wouldn't pick it up.
So that's that being authentic. That's an important thing. I want to get into that a little bit later. So let's remember and hold on to that.
Okay.
So the third culture, then at 25, you moved to the U.S. What about the U.S. culture? Did you say, oh, these are things I really want to hold on to?
The sense of creativity, openness, being able to be who you want to be. Professionally, it was a fabulous world to live in and work in because you're given permission to reinvent yourself. I grew up in a world where you were shaped by your training. You were only an expert in your own area of training. Whereas in the US, people talk about expertise based on experience as well. But this was a legitimate form of training and exposure. And therefore, if you have experience in something, even though you were not trained in it, you can claim expertise. And I struggled with that so much. As much as I loved that concept, I really had a hard time overcoming it. And still to this day, I would say I have experience in and never say expertise. There's certain parts where I struggle.
That humbleness kind of kicks in.
Yeah. And I think it's because it aligns more with who I am. And I have a sense of, yes, I love the openness, but it's still contained within a narrower boundary, if you like.
I want to be provocative for a moment here, if I may.
Of course.
Thanks.
I love it, the challenge.
We don't know each other that well, so I think I should warn you first.
I love challenges.
Okay, so here's the question. When you say that you are okay to say I have experience and not expertise, even if there's a likelihood that you truly have the expertise, do you think, aside from the humbleness culture that influences you, do you think there's also a part of it? Because I think globally, if we stereotype, it's, for a woman, it's much more precarious to claim expertise because she's more likely to get criticized or put down for it by both men and women.
Yeah, interesting. Not so much for me. Even though I grew up in the Middle East, forgive me, my father was very progressive in many ways. And one of his general sort of repeated statements were, I want you to get a good education. I want you to be able to stand on your own 2 feet. So if you happen to marry somebody you don't like, you can kick him and you can take care of yourself.
Wow.
Period. I also came from a family where my grandfather on my mother's side used to drive my aunts and my uncle across the desert to Lebanon to put them at school so that they can be educated, can take care of themselves and not depend on anyone. And one of my aunts was one of 4 women to train as a doctor in the Middle East at that time. My grandmother on my mother's side had a high school degree. So we came from a rich background of belief in education and being independent and standing for our, ourselves. And my dad used to always say, if you believe in something strongly, it doesn't matter what the rest of the world believes in. Stand up, hold your head high, and make your voice heard. And so I always grew up with that concept. So to me, it's like I dismiss or don't even respond to the pressures that come from outside around who I am and what I can do or cannot do.
For me, I had something similar. My mom's philosophy was failure is an opportunity to learn something. Yeah. And I just grew up with it. I was just like, oh, that's cool. And I didn't, and it wasn't until years later that I came to appreciate it. I was dating a Swiss guy and I was starting my own business and he was sitting back watching me and he was horrified. He's like, Amy, you're not concerned if you're going to fail. You just say yes to things and it might fail. And I thought about that. I was like, yeah, that's true. He said, if I embark on something, I'm going to make sure that there's no chance I'm going to fail. And if there's a chance I'm going to fail, I'm going to do everything I can to make sure it's mitigated or I won't agree to it. And and it was fascinating to have that awareness. And I thought about where did that come from? So that whole story is to ask you, you grew up with that philosophy of your father's. At what point, or was there a point that you stood back and went, wow, how awesome that I got that education, that teaching, that attitude as a child? Was there an aha moment for you to realize that was pretty significant?
I'm not sure that there was a specific time. It's almost like it was built in because by comparison, it's just growing up in an environment where other fathers were not like that. Girls were sort of seen as, in many other places, secondary. The boy gets, in Lebanon at the time when I was growing up, the boy was the one who was focused on. The boy gets to get the education. The boy gets to lead the family business, etc. And so it was always all around me. The contrast was always there. So I was, I can't say I was always aware. There was a sense of awareness, but I don't know that there was this particular point.
Got it.
That triggered it.
Yeah, because you were so young, you grew up with it for so long. I see. Yeah. So I want to ask you, knowing that you speak 3.5, 4.5 languages, how did growing up in a trilingual environment impact your way of being in the world?
I guess my world was never anchored in any one purist culture. I have this perception, and I don't know if it's true or not, it's just a perception, that if one grows monolingual in one's own country, and it's predominantly monolingual, as in the US or the UK or France, that there's a narrower sort of scope of how you look at the world initially growing up. Our exposure was between kind of having access to different languages gave me access to different cultures. I grew up in studying in a private school that was a bilingual French-Arabic school. We were exposed to the French culture through the language. We studied French history, French geography, etc. And so there was always that sort of wider world that we were exposed to. American culture, the movies, the English language, we had the British as well as the American access to it. So it's always been a blend. And in fact, what's ironic, and I call it mental laziness, whenever we talk to each other as friends in Lebanon, single sentence, 3 languages kick in the same sentence. My dad used to challenge us and say, I bet you can't stick to one language for one sentence. He was right. I couldn't.
Wow, that's fascinating.
Yeah. So the brain begins to kind of think differently. You begin to, it's almost like language is only a mechanism to get your thoughts through, and it doesn't matter what language you use.
Yeah.
It's whatever word pops up in whatever language just comes up. That's it.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's true that there are certain words in certain languages that just fit better, make more sense, easier to explain the concept. Yeah. I get it.
Yeah.
You describe yourself as a reformed control freak. How did you transform this?
Okay. Full disclosure and honesty, work in progress. I became more and more aware of my control freak character, probably in my, as I began to work professionally, where, because I tend to be highly motivated, task-oriented, I like to get things done, very practical on some level. I needed things to be done in a certain way, and it needed to be my way. And so as I began to work, when you report to others, you can live in that universe more easily. It's when I began to have direct reports that I began to become very aware of my need to have things done my way, and I'm somebody who always disliked being restricted. My own personal space and freedom is so important that just because I want to treat people the way I like to be treated, that became the motivator. So I started noticing how I would try to guide people, and I needed to change that. So I began to figure out, well, what can I do to get myself to be less of a controlling person?
Okay.
Step 1, manage my control need. And I still think I'm in that stage up to a point. So if I wanted something done by a certain point, I would kind of create the cushion, the different layers of what do I need to do if it all fails and I need to fix it? How much time do I have? So I try to, create a space where I get people to do their own thing, let them experience it, fail or succeed their own way, then step in and provide the support as needed along the way if they ask for it, or afterwards.
So if I hear you correctly is you're aware that you have this tendency. 2, when you're leading others, you purposely create a cushion for yourself of where you know that if you cross beyond that, then you're going to start to get the point where you're jittery and
Correct.
wanting to do it in a certain time frame or your way. You don't necessarily inform them of it, that you're doing that so that you can allow them. You do.
I do say, if you can get it done. So what I do, I'm very transparent. And I tell people, I want you to be able to do it your way. Please feel free to come and check in with me if you need any help. I need to let you do it your own way, because there are more than one way of doing things. And I want to honor that. But know that by this date, if it's not done, or if it's not done to the level that we need it to be, we can either work together or I'll take over and do it. So I open that space so they also feel they have a safety net. And it doesn't come with judgment. It comes with, this is a learning opportunity.
Right.
Run with it.
Beautiful.
So.
And now this might be related, being, you say that you're very, well, actually, to me, this is the opposite. This is what I find is so fascinating. You say you're comfortable with the unknown, being in limbo. And this is not typical for many people.
No, true.
How did you achieve this?
I think it's partly personality and partly perception. I strongly believe in attitude. It's what you bring to the session. My attitude when I get into a limbo state, I have a choice of how I would look at it. And the way I see it is, great opportunity. The unknown, the unplanned. I might discover new things I may not otherwise have a chance to discover. So I sit there and sit in that space and let it happen to me and with me instead of resisting it. That is easy when it's something that's not emotionally challenging or physically challenging. That scares me. If it doesn't have the fear element to it, I'm perfectly fine and I become more creative. Mm-hmm. If there's a fear element, then I kind of hunker down and kind of say, okay, let's run out the clock. Just hang in there, be resilient. It has to come to an end. And that's how I keep myself going if the limbo is uncomfortable.
Wow, that's very powerful. So you ride that wave knowing, and in a way I think I hear is that you're giving yourself empathy of saying, of course it's going to feel uncomfortable. Yeah. I'm in limbo. That's
it's when there's the emotional threat.
Yeah. So listen, we're going to take a break in a moment. And when we come back, Rima, I would love for you to share the first time you had your first aha moment, awareness, and your ability to choose how you want to be in the world. When we come back and that's when we come back from the break. Though for listeners, if you want to connect with Rima, you can email her with the following email: intoitcoaching@gmail.com. And that's coaching@gmail.com. Or check out her website in www.intoitcoaching.com. So we'll hear more from Rima shortly. Stay tuned because you're listening to Partner Up with Amy Carroll on the Voice America Business Channel. Welcome back to Partner Up with Amy Carroll. My guest today is Dr. Rima Azzam, and she's a trained psychologist, educator, and coach. So we've been talking a lot, Rima, about your background and how it's formed you to be the person you are today. When you and I talked, you mentioned something about having an insight at the age of 11. I'd love for you to share that story.
Yeah, I was 11 years old and I don't remember what happened, but I remember getting so upset and angry at my older sister. We got into a fight and I was so mad at her that I just picked up a bunch of her 45 vinyls, stacked them up.
That's records for people who don't know what vinyls are.
That's right, like ancient history, 45 vinyls, stacked them up and held a hammer and smashed them. I was so angry and I had reflecting back as an adult, I recognized that I had no tools to manage my anger or control it or figure out how to kind of dissipate or work with it. So it had to exit my body. I just had to release it. And that was how I released it. And as soon as I did that and I watched the scene of what I had done, I was horrified. I was like, I don't like what I've done and I don't want to be that person. That was my aha. And from that point forward, I became very...
Let me check. When you say I don't like what I've done, I don't like that person, it was more like that. It's not that you did this thing that you, because you were still angry at your sister, I imagine. It was more like the idea that you could lose control to that level.
Yes, it's sort of just in that moment, the visual of seeing those broken records and the fact that I did not control myself and that I didn't know how to deal with it. And how it appeared to me was like, oh my God, that's ugly. That is not something that I want to do or want to be. I don't want to be in that kind of state. So I think that was the time when I made kind of a child promise to myself that I was going to work on who I wanted to be. I wanted to choose who I wanted to be. And that was my starting point of self-development, I think.
As I'm listening to the story, I realized that I had a similar experience, except it happened much later, though it did also involve my older sister.
Aren't older sisters great?
Yeah, I got to tell you. Luckily for her, it had nothing to do with any of her 45 vinyls.
Yeah, she lucked out.
Yes, she did. In this case, I used to go to her and say, oh, Pat, there was a 10-year age gap. And so I was starting out at 15, 16, 17 years old. And and I would have a job after job. I'd have a difficult boss, and I'd complain to her, and she'd always be supportive and empathic. Well, Rima, about the 8th time I called her, she's like, Amy, honey, nobody has that kind of trouble.
Nobody has so many bad bosses in a row.
Nobody has that much bad luck as you do. I'm like, really? So that was like a huge aha to realize that I was the common denominator. And so there was a combination of excitement this awareness meant that I could change something, except also fear and anxiety. Like, I don't know what to do, and I don't know how to fix it. I don't know what to fix. All I know is that I want to fix whatever this thing is.
Yeah.
Luckily, and this is, we're going to be talking about coaching in a moment. This is such a powerful insight for coachees. They don't always have to know the how to get, the results they want right away.
There's an important piece here for me as you're talking about this. And I think in my case, it was self-awareness coming from within. And in your case, it was observation that was shared with you from the outside. And I find that for me, when somebody finds their own self-awareness, it's a choice they make. And therefore, it's easier to accept and work with than when it is sort of presented from the outside. It sort of takes a little bit the edge off the fear, I think, at least for me.
Yeah. Luckily, my sister didn't present it in a way, an ultimatum, because it didn't really impact her. She was just there always supporting me. She held the mirror up, and I think maybe earlier in a few years earlier, I maybe wouldn't have been ready for it. I would have resisted it, though it happily still worked in a way that gave me that motivation to change without that fear. Yeah.
Because it was a gentle sort of mirror without judgment, but kind
supportive.
Of notice. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
That's beautiful.
So that's a really interesting point that you make, because there's been other times in my life where I see, I came to the conclusion myself. And I don't know if this is true for you in your coaching. I have coachees who, I give, because I act as my sister acted to me, right? And I'll hold the mirror up to them and I give them some bad news. I'm like, okay, you're coming across as a jerk. I know you might not mean it, and I use playfulness and everything. So they're able to hear it, and they say, oh my gosh, my husband's been telling me that for years, or my, partner, my girlfriend. And I think if we could only be willing to listen to our partners, people would save a lot of money on coaching. This is something I said in an episode recently, though it's one of for whatever reason, our egos, there is this resistance to listening to our partners sometimes.
Yeah. The emotional package that comes along.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You have said to me that you look to others for models. What are examples of this?
So again, around the age of 11 is when I became aware of the power of observation and models. I have a childhood friend of mine who was always gregarious, full of joy, full of laughter. And I remember watching her and thinking, oh, how beautiful to be in that state. And I wanted to be more like her. So that was kind of one example. I've always found myself observing people and always looking to see, what do I like about who they are, or what they do, or how they act, or how they think, that I could make as part of who I am. So it's always been part of how I look at engagement with people and interactions. For example, I had a colleague of mine who was my boss and became very protective of me and wanted to kind of give me a chance to grow professionally. And we got to a place where they were kind of laying off people, and they wanted to lay me off because I was the last one in, first one out. She gave up part of her salary to secure my staying put, because she believed in the knowledge I had, the expertise, the work that we needed to do. And she did it without my knowledge. I only overheard it by chance, because the boss was talking to her on the phone and I could hear from my office the conversation. And so there's sometimes those values that people carry shows you the best of who we are sometimes. And being able to be in that place made me feel like, think about what that represents, and how can I be there for others in similar ways. So people give you ideas of how you can be a better person, or on the flip side, seeing behavior from others where I look at them and go, oh, I certainly don't want to be that kind of person.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's always that sort of observation and just being curious and recognizing that there's so much creativity and so many different ways of being that it's enriching. It's just a way of growing.
Yeah.
Constantly developing who I am.
Yeah. And I feel like it's a very positive way to cheat with self-development. And find someone who you already emulate, you admire, you appreciate. And sometimes to help stretch ourselves, I'll say to myself, if I was that person, how would I act in this moment? Yeah. And sometimes it just makes the next step much easier than it would be if we were figuring it out on our own.
Yeah. It's sort of free lessons.
Yeah.
Free training.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Rima, I'm curious to know, I want to dive more now into your coaching experience and background. And I know you have this great tagline, helping clients seek and find answers from within. What first attracted you to coaching?
I've always been sort of the counselor for friends. People would come to me for advice, for helping them sort through their problems. And so they would, for the longest time, colleagues, friends, family members would say, you'd be a great coach. Why don't you do coaching? And so eventually, as I was getting ready to think about, well, what kind of retirement gig do I want to have? I'm not somebody who's going to sit and retire and twiddle my thumbs. I wanted something that will keep me engaged. And so I thought, that might be a nice sort of way of staying engaged. And I love working with people and being kind of a support to them. So I enrolled in Coach U and started doing it formally. And it was interesting because I loved the growth that I went through that process. And it made me feel like, well, one realization was, what I was doing was definitely not coaching in terms of the classical sense.
Sure.
It was a hybrid of coaching and counseling and guiding. And I just loved that combination. And certainly the training and coaching taught me a lot of new skills I did not have. And so now I'm at the stage where I'm trying to create my own hybrid because I really feel I belong in a world that's sort of more a combination of counseling, guiding, and coaching.
Yeah.
And what I realized is that whenever I offered guidance, I always offered it as something to consider, almost in a question form for people. So never wanting to impose, but rather offer a kind of ideas. Yeah. And so for me, it's all about needing to own something for it to be of value. If we don't truly believe in something, or if it doesn't really connect with who we are, it's as if you're donning on a scarf. You put it on, you take it off, it's not really you. And it doesn't last. So that aspect of anchoring, helping people get to a place that's deeper knowledge of who they are, or who and how to work with kind of developing who they want to be, is really what really keeps me engaged in coaching, or what triggers it for me.
And I'm curious if you have a couple of concrete examples of, you focus on self-development for yourself, for your clients. What have some of the benefits been that you have seen from people?
So I had one client who came in relatively young, by my assessment, not very, has a strong desire to change, but not much self-awareness available to him at that point. And so as we were working, he had sort of challenges, emotional challenges around one topic. And I found that as I was trying to have him sort of reflect, dig deeper, kind of get awareness of when those emotional instances were triggered, he just didn't know how to even begin to look at it or figure it out. So I went into more of the counseling mode and sort of asking questions, giving ideas, kind of asking him if this was true or not, kind of just probing as we went along. And then try to create situations by modeling, or using the background that I had in psychology, try to find distractions for him. So for example, he would get into a mental loop where he couldn't get out of that sort of what I would call being trapped in that loop. I don't want to give away any of the information for privacy's sake, but he would get into that mental loop. And so little tricks. I gave him a little thinking putty, gave it to him.
Say it again, a little thinking
putty. It's a little putty that you can play with, just like a
putty.
Putty, yeah, like pâte à modeler.
Yeah, like what is that? The colorful.
Yes, kind of sort of
Play-Doh.
Something similar, yeah.
Okay.
So, something similar to Play-Doh. Gave it to him, just got him to play with it, started having conversations. And next thing he realizes, and then, he's playing with it, then we stop, and then I ask him a question to check in on his emotional state of mind. He goes, wow, I just disconnected from it. I said, what do you think happened? And he just couldn't figure it out. And I said, I distracted you with the Play-Doh or the thinking putty. And it broke the constant obsession over the same thought. And it was like, so this was an external guidance to help him notice something that was happening to him that he wasn't picking up. Mm-hmm. Work continued for several sessions. And finally, one day, through that whole process, he turns to me, he goes, wow, I just realized something. I said, what is it? He goes, my fear of getting into that state is what gets me into that state. So if I'm aware of that fear, I can tell it, no, you're not going to push me there. That snapped it. That was the end of getting caught in that cycle. Even though he knew he had the option of, all along, he could take medication if he needed it. He could and we worked on a series of different strategies that will help create that distraction to break the cycle of that loop.
What were some of the other examples of distraction that you came up with?
Going out for a walk. So I would say what helps you kind of relax or, break away or give yourself a chance to sort of step away from that emotional state. He recognized that going outside and walking for a little while helps, or standing on the balcony and smoking a cigarette, or listening to some music, just enough for 5 or 10 minutes to sort of physically move him from the environment to another environment. So the probing was all around what he used or found useful to him. Gave him some other techniques, deep breathing, making a phone call to a friend around some other topic. So we kind of played around with different strategies to kind of help make him feel he has different tools he can use in different situations. Including if he's in the middle of a meeting, can he step away? If he cannot, what can he do with his fingers underneath the table to break the cycle? So there were lots of different tricks and strategies, but the understanding of how it was triggered was so key for him to be able to overcome it, the fear it generated with it. So powerful.
It reminds me a little bit of something my sister said recently about when we're having these negative emotions that you sort of, it's like they're an unexpected house guest. And you want to invite them in, like, by just acknowledging it, naming it. He took it one step further. He acknowledged it and put a limit, no. Though sometimes it's just the awareness piece is sometimes such a key element.
Yeah.
So when you have clients who lack self-awareness, you explained with him, the approach you took. Do you ever sometimes think this person's not coachable, or do you think there's something else underneath the surface that is creating that lack of self-awareness?
I believe that there are some people who are not coachable, or at least at certain points in their lives or in a certain situation are not coachable.
Sure.
And it's a question of readiness. Sometimes they do have a desire or they're curious, but they're not really ready. Yeah. And I think it's important to honor that.
You just made me think. I was just on a call this afternoon with a client who I worked with him last time we worked together was a year and a half ago. He had 2 hours remaining he had never used. He canceled appointments. Finally, today we spoke, and I think he was feeling a mixture of disappointment, maybe some, shame or embarrassment, because he said, Amy, I feel like I've just slipped back, maybe even, prior to how I was with the coaching. And I feel like I didn't benefit from all the coaching we did. Then it could have helped me so much in these scenarios that I was dealing with. And then he said on his own, maybe this is a good thing. And I was like, okay, Amy, shut up, keep your mouth shut. Tell me more. And he could see, and I shared that quote of when the enemy of the great is not the bad, the enemy of the great is the good. And I said, what I hear you just said to me was that maybe the fact that it's bad is motivating you to do what you need to do to get out of that negative space, and to be able to create the kind of relationships you want and how you want to be in the world. And so that was really cool to see him go through that process on his own.
These are, I think, the most powerful, because that self-awareness is what becomes the motivator and opens them up to be more receptive to even paying attention to their own blind spots or their own vulnerabilities. And I think that's so important. And there is a gift to that. I think when people are in an environment where they feel safe and they feel they're not really being judged, but accepted, they tend to be gentler towards themselves as well.
So I want to ask you more about that, because you've told me that people describe you as someone who shows up in a way that makes people feel safe, non-judgmental, and authentic. How would you coach someone to show up in this way?
It is being able to be accepting of who you are. It does not change your desire to want to change and grow and be better. But very early on, I would say, probably when I turned 13, I became aware of I was exposed or seeing the serenity quote. God give me the wisdom to tell the difference,
let's talk about that. So let me see if I can remember it. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change.
To change the things I can.
The courage to change the things I can. And the wisdom to know the difference.
Between the two,
Okay, good.
There were different variations, and I loved it so much. I actually wrote it on the back of my clipboard
at 13.
At 13, I loved it. And it just sort of spoke to this whole, again, self-development, wanting to change. And it's really about understanding that we have a desire to change, but being accepting of the fact that sometimes we try and we just fail. And we can't change certain things. And if we can't change them, instead of beating ourselves up on it, accept it and move on. And so that kind of kindness to oneself is the space that allows that feeling of, it's fine. It's fine to be who I am. It's fine to have the good side and the bad side. It doesn't mean that I approve of the things that are kind of not so nice. But if I can call out myself on them, recognize them, that's already a big achievement. And so being in that space means that we're more likely to be willing to look at our own vulnerabilities and call them out. And I came to understand that, again, as a teenager, boarding school with our, made a very, very close connections with friends. And one of them is my best friend to this day. And she was the first person I was able to speak to her about my vulnerabilities, even to the point of exposing vulnerabilities that I wasn't willing to tell myself about. It sort of pushed that far. And feeling that I could do that with her because it was safe. And that made me understand how important creating that space is. It wasn't a conscious understanding at the time. It was just a feeling. And that carried with me. And as I kind of reflected on that, and as I went through the years growing up and growing and kind of developing relationships and working through, interactions with people, I began to recognize the value of that sort of, when we're able to call our own vulnerabilities, people cannot use them against us anymore. And that's the place that makes us feel safer, because what are we afraid of? Exposure, ridicule, etc.
Judgment. Okay, so by proactively accept who, what you have and who you are and how you're being in the world, whether it's ideal or not, and then exposing that and sharing that with people. And, it makes me think of Brene Brown and the power of vulnerability. Doing those things then can help you to be less judgmental and you're certainly being more authentic in the world. So that's one of the ways you help your clients to get there.
And get them to sort of call it out and see how they feel when they do that. And recognizing that not everybody is going to be as warm and supportive, but when you begin to accept yourself and care for yourself, then you've got that power that resides within you. So how do you keep your inner power versus handing it over to others? And just creating the experience and how they feel and how it opens them up to be more creative and more willing to tackle the things that they want to tackle.
Say that last part again, being willing to tackle
things that they want to tackle. And I have one client who is very much about creating space to grow. And I would always challenge her. She would say, I am somebody who needs to control the outcome. And I'd say, you're going back into control again, through playfulness, through laughter. And she goes, you are right. I'm trying to control again. So it's sort of creating that caring, loving mirror, as your sister did with you.
Nice. So Rima, we are just about out of time. And before I let you go, I'd like to ask you to share with listeners one call for action. What would that be?
I would say I'd invite the listeners kind of use this week to play and experiment with two types of communication approaches. One in which you kind of get into an exchange with a clear agenda, like what do I want to get out of this exchange? And the second, where you go in with more of a detached sense towards the outcome. And just reflect on the experience that you have and kind of what did you discover and learn in each of those scenarios? Which approach offered greater enjoyment, enrichment, and or satisfaction, and why? Having that experience helps us understand how we can empower communication to be more of what we want it to be and more enriching, rather than having the ego and the agenda be the pusher.
And this speaks directly to a topic we didn't get to dive into, which you and I both share equally, the power of being detached from the outcome.
Yes.
And people say to me, well, Amy, if I'm attached to the outcome, how do I get myself detached? And what I say to them, tell me what you think, is just by simply acknowledging that you're attached to an outcome, a specific outcome, you become less attached. You're just it's kind of like you're waving the flag and admitting to it, and it loosens it up a tiny bit.
Exactly. Very true. And being able to recognize that by being detached, you will be able to observe and get more out of it than you would otherwise.
Say that one more time. When
you detach from it.
When you detach, okay.
When you detach, you have more of an opportunity to be the observer and take in more of the exchange and be enriched by it.
Got it. So listeners, you can connect with Rima on her website, which I'll repeat again. It's www.intoitcoaching.com, and that's with the number 2, or intoit@gmail.com. Now, my call for action is to send me your communication conundrums, clashes, challenges, mishaps, blunders, and successes via email or through social media. And I will read them. I'll discuss them on future shows, make suggestions for you. My email is amy@carrollcoaching.com, and that's 2 R's and 2 L's. Rima, thank you so much. It's been an absolute delight.
Thank you. I loved it. Thank you so much.
So listeners, if you're game for more, I'm going to be hopping over to Facebook Live 5 minutes past the hour for a short chat on today's show rather. Feel free to connect with me on my social media channels, Amy Carroll Coaching, my website, carrollcoaching.com. Thank you for tuning in. You've been listening to Partner Up with Amy Carroll on the Voice America Business Channel. Be sure to tune in next week. And in the meantime, everyone, happy partnering.